Got a pretty one here today, Retina Ia, very nice condition. Look at all the paint on the back of that, very unusual. So, what are the features of the early ones? Well, one of the obvious features is the rewind knob. They have a smaller diameter rewind knob with the film reminder dial being on the top cover underneath it. I see in this case that the scale is missing off the film reminder dial, so that makes it a little bit of a useless feature. I'm reasonably confident I don't have a scale that I can put on there, but I'll certainly check through my pieces. The camera itself, well, it winds. The shutter certainly works at the higher speeds. On the lower speeds, it simply sticks open. So I'll strip this down and service it, but I thought you'd just like a look at an early Retina Ia camera, one that's in particularly tidy condition. No one's even slid a flash into the accessory shoe at the top and put the traditional scratch down the middle of it. So I'm interested to see this one. And what's the shutter? Was it a synchro Compur? Or, no, it's Compur-Rapid shutter. So it's got all the features of the early ones. Oh well, I'll show you when I get to the shutter, because they're slightly different of course than the synchro Compurs on the later cameras. I'm taking the camera apart and I noticed something unusual. There's a washer, a shim washer or spacer washer sitting directly on top of the clutch assembly. Now that is something I've not encountered before, at least not from memory, so I don't know why that was done. I expect the answer will come out in the fullness of time, because what I'll do is when I reassemble the camera I'll see if it behaves without that spacer washer and with the spacer washer, and see what difference I note, if any. I was just looking at the gear on the top of the sprocket shaft there. It looked as though it was there was a missing tooth, but it was just a trick of the light. Right, was there anything else strange as I've got it down this far? Not really. The frame counter spring here is an early example. See if I can get this down on the tabletop. And you can tell them because they've got an extra sort of bend to the tooth at the end that drives the wheel. So instead of having a single bend here, they've got a second bend down here and it's longer, and presumably they engage another ratchet tooth or so further over, but otherwise they work in exactly the same way. Why there was a change at that point I don't know. Whether it helped things when they changed the style to using the shorter spring, it almost looks like it would make it worse, more likely to break if it was a shorter spring than the longer spring, because you would have all your flex taken over a shorter distance and in fact taken over a fairly sharp bend. Right, back to work. Here you can see the base of the film advance, and you'll notice that instead of the the cross-shaped pressed metal piece on the end, it has a rod. So you've got two arms that would disengage the frame counter catch, the rewind button catch. This is quite sticky. You can possibly tell there's an unpleasant green colour to that grease. Well, we know all about green grease. Like all the early 1A and 2A cameras, this little shield here surrounds the rewind button is very flat. It's not raised at all. It doesn't protect the button and stop it being depressed to any great extent. And it's also got countersunk holes here, and the screws that are used to hold it in place are these little nickel plated screws here, not the brass screws with quite a broad head that you see on the later cameras. So this certainly has all the features of a fairly early camera. I'd be interested to check the serial number and see how early it is, I think. Back to work. Well, here's something interesting, and you can't blame this on it just being early production. We've got our usual selection of film chips down here from badly loaded films, but the take-up spool here is very, very rough. You can see the surface of that, it's exceptionally rough. And the same down the sides here. So what's happened to that? That's solvent damage. It means that someone squirted a solvent into the base of the camera, presumably to attempt to alleviate some stiffness or fix some other perceived problem. There's no sign that they achieved anything like that, because quite clearly the leather has never been off the base of the camera. No one ever actually delved into the film advance to any great extent, but someone has clearly squirted some solvent in here and damaged that take-up spool. Now, the collar that sits on the bottom of that's looks got a bit of corrosion and rubbish on it by the looks of it. I'll have to see if I can find a new spool for this camera, I think. Right, back to work. I was really concentrating on the very obvious damage at the base of that take-up spool, but really, looking at the state of this, it's clear that the solvent was poured in at the top of the film advance mechanism, and it simply travelled its way down probably the shaft and the outside of the spool, and the damage we see at the bottom here is the residual from the pooled solvent. But look at the state of the top of that sprocket there, that take-up spool. That's clearly where the solvent was poured on. This is so warped from the softened plastic that I doubt whether film would wrap around that neatly at all. I doubt it. I don't think it would work well. As I work my way back through reassembling the camera, I've come to the return spring for the rewind button catch, and I noticed that it appears to be a lighter spring wire than was used on later cameras, and the spring was actually a little bit collapsed. It was a bit compressed, so there was obviously a change made there at some stage during manufacturing. So I'll just measure this with my calipers and see what I get. 0.25 millimeters. And here's one from a later camera. Let's see what that measures. 0.3 millimeters. So you can say that they beefed up the spring there by 20%. Right, I'll carry on. Well, here is our solvent damaged take-up spool, and it's a pretty bad state. Now I noticed that this had a plain spacer washer under the base of it. Now that's unusual. The most of the production had a collar, little protruding collar on there, and that locates it firmly in the bottom of the spool. Now I noticed that the same thing would fit this solvent damaged spool, so the spool is exactly the same, and it does have a slightly formed recess in the base there, which would take a collar like that, but for some reason this has a plain disc underneath there. I can only think that there was a change made in production, and that the spools, the plastic spools, had changed in design, but they had some of these left over, which they used in preference to their later offerings. I'm just checking that the height and thickness of that's all the same. So that plain washer and that damaged spool can go to one side, and I'll use this replacement which comes from a later Retina 1A or 2A camera. In function it should be identical. There's nothing to see from the outside, but it's just certainly just a slight difference there in manufacturing technique. And as I say, the spools are identical, but the spacer wasn't. Even though the later spacer, the main production spacer, would certainly have fitted that spool. Never mind, I've just got to put my take-up shaft in place, Film Advanced shaft. I'm just checking the state of this. So I can see that didn't clean entirely in my cleaner. The gummy grease has hardened up in here, and I'm going to have to use something stronger. That's been cleaned in an ultrasonic cleaner in Naphtha. No, in a painter's wax and grease remover, which is more aggressive than Naphtha is, but it hasn't removed that grease at all. So I'm going to have to clean that manually with something even stronger. Well, best laid plans and all that. I had assumed that I could use that spacer, that everything would fit nicely, but when I came to put this in the camera, I discovered that that shaft wouldn't actually pass up in there. The base on this piece here is larger diameter, and so it should have fitted like that. So regardless of my desire to use that nice one with the raised piece on the centre of it, I'm going to be using the original piece because it's got a larger hole through the centre, and that allows it to seat round here correctly. Oh well, live and learn. Here I have the guide bush from the top of the Film Advance. This piece is where the clutch goes in, and looking in there, that's quite scarred up. It's got a lot of marks there that it shouldn't have. Now that was where that stray washer, that spacer washer, had been fitted. And looking at the marks that are here, basically it should never have been there. It's been rubbing in there and causing problems. Looking at the wear marks on it, they match up with that entirely, and that is unusual. That's not a normal wear pattern. There shouldn't have been anything in there. It should have been, this guide bush should have been sitting directly over the top of that clutch. It didn't require that space there. I suspect that spacer was used in the camera, and I'll show you that later, but it wouldn't have been used there. And that points to someone having had this apart at some stage at the top, which of course ties in quite nicely with my idea that somebody squirted solvent in from the top. Another difference, this piece here, this drive dog, in this camera that's plain. It's just a flat piece of sheet metal that's been stamped out. This is the more common production. It has a recess in here. The spring that holds this down, in this camera, it's cylindrical, it's plain. In the more common production, it's conical in section, with the larger part end of it sitting in that recess. So certainly a change in production practices there too. This is quite interesting, this one. Here's some other differences in design. This is the one from this camera. You'll see that it's quite skeletal here. It's got a big cutout at this point. Different shape hole here, less movement there. And the shape of this piece here, this is the catch that holds the Film Advance lever locked once you reach number 1. The shape of that catch is quite different from the shape of the catch here. It's got a less pronounced ramp on it than this one. And so yeah, there's certainly a design change there. This one's a fairly rough example, but I have to say that good Film Advance levers for the Retina 1As, 2As are not as common as you might hope, because often they've been broken. So yes, certainly differences here in machining. There's a slot being machined in here where there's not one present at that point. However, we'll carry on, get this thing on there. The mystery washer would have sat exactly there on top of that gear, and basically its task in life is to keep this disc pressed down so that this lever here, when it rises to the upper position, is able to clear the bottom half of the disc and allow the mechanism to rotate to its rest position. So I'll put on the advanced lever there and the frame counter spring. We'll just put a touch of grease on that. Set that down in position there. Now I've got my frame counter components here all together. I've got to the wavy washer now. The wavy washer is unusual. It's got a slight notch in the centre of it there. I don't think you'd be able to see that. It's a slight notch and it looks like the end of it had been turned up. It's a squared off notch. Now I suspect that means that there was a tab that came off here as it was originally manufactured, and it was probably intended to lock into something, so to locate it correctly. And that tab is obviously not present, and in later cameras there's no such tab. So I think that there was a change of design there too. Excuse me. I don't even know where I was when I was rudely interrupted by that phone call, but while I was talking I carried on, and the film advance is working nicely. Nice and smooth, no problems there at all. I'm just going to put the rewind on this camera. You don't need to watch that because it's not very exciting. Well, I was just saying that you didn't need to watch this process because it's not very exciting, but I see something strange. Now normally there's one hole in the side. That's where the screw goes through. It runs in this slot and allows you to raise the rewind knob. So I put the screw in a hole, everything looked good, and then I rotated it and there's another hole. There's another hole further up. So this has two holes drilled in it, which will provide the lift for the rewind knob at two different heights. It looks to me like this was the original, that the shaft had been nickel plated, and then that this hole here had been drilled at a later date, which means that the later one is probably the correct one. So it looks to me like there had been a hiccup in the manufacturing process, if you like, that there'd been a change of heart in what height that should have been. I'll just check to see if that looks about right to me. Yeah, that's that much lift. Of course, if this was in the lower down hole, there would be much less lift. It would be something down like that, so it hardly lift at all. So this is certainly the correct one. But there was clearly a mistake made in manufacturing. So it means that this camera is probably of quite early manufacture. And although clearly not a prototype or anything, it means that they were still shaking out some of the design at that stage. I don't know if I told you or not, here's where that washer goes, that spacer that was further down the mechanism than it should have been, sitting on top of the clutch. I'll just put this on. I think we're just about done then. Just rotate that until everything drops into place. That's better. Do that up. Yeah, frame counter's working nicely. Shutter release works smoothly. So the camera body, zoom you out of it. The camera body's good now. That's all ready to go. So now all I've got to do is turn my attention to the shutter. I did have a chance to check up on the serial numbers. This one was made in January 51, and that means it's very early production, probably in the first few hundred cameras that came down the line. And I expect that would explain some of the oddities that I'm finding in it as I go through it. Anyway, next to the shutter. So here I have the shutter assembly. Everything here is very shiny looking. It's makes me wonder whether the camera didn't have some fairly large drawback right from early in its life for it to be as shiny as it is at this late stage. I'll just use a friction tool to get the lens out of the shutter. Pop those pieces to one side. So the shutter here, as you can see, is open, stuck open. If we turn it to a higher shutter speed, yeah, it drops in. So it's reluctant to move. What was that beep? I don't know whether the battery's dying on this camera. Everything appears to be recording. I'll find the right screwdriver, open this, and you can see what the difference is between this shutter and the synchro compur that we usually find on the Retina 1As and 2As. So the lock here, let's rotate that lock, and I can rotate the front of the shutter. This is all very sticky. That doesn't want to move. I suspect it's stuck there with grease, dried grease. No, it's more than that. It's quite sticky. Okay, so we're into the shutter itself. As you can see, it's got none of the control gear for the flash sync. It's quite a simple shutter. This is basically a Compur-Rapid with a flash sync setting fitted here. So I should be able to lift things out. Let's start here. Take the spring off the main lever. Remove that from the shutter. That's our high speed spring for the 1/500th of a second speed. We can remove that. The shutter release lever here, I'm just checking to see where its spring sits. That can be lifted off its post. This catch holds the shutter in the cocked position. We'll just remove that from its, remove that. That acts on this lever here, which is our B lever. That looks a bit suspicious in shape. So I'm not going to bend it yet, because sometimes bends were there for a good and sufficient reason. You can see that tab that I'm worried about there. See how that's not at 90 degrees? It's like nothing like 90 degrees. I don't know whether that's accidental damage from somebody tugging on the levers, or whether it's intended and it's done as an adjustment. It doesn't look pretty regardless. I think I can take the outer flash shutter case off now. 2 screws, and the shutter case is very much the same as it would be for the later shutters. The flash sync connection, the wire should come in from the side in the same way. I slacken off the lock screw. be able to get the wire out. Oh, it's a bit reluctant. Somebody did that up extra tight. That's the detents for the... What was that? Was that my insulator? That was. That little black thing there is my black plastic insulator from in here. It's just fallen out. I've got to watch that. It's very easy to lose that. I'll take that screw out while I'm here, and I will pop those tiny parts in a dish out of harm's way. The shutter body, what are we at? Stage we at here? That's just the body. Right, I can split the case. 3 screws hold this in place. I'll tell you what, I'll see if I can get that flash contact off there first. That'll be made of some styrene type plastic, quite vulnerable to damage. Though solvent damage is the biggest cause of problems with these parts. They can be absolutely destroyed with a bit of solvent. That really doesn't want to push out, so I won't fight it. I'll just take the 3 screws out from the back of the case. It will come out when I lift the case apart. So, January 51, hey? Well, that's a long time ago. Okay, so there's the shutter case. Let's get that flash contact free. Is it going to come off? Yes, it is. It's cracked. These are usually cracked. That styrene's quite brittle, but it's complete. It's still doing its job. Put this aside. Let's have a look at the case first. The aperture setting is quite sticky. The blades don't look particularly oily, but the aperture setting lever is reluctant to move. It may mean there's just dried grease under the lever here. I'll just remove that. I'll check the action of that diaphragm, see if it's free. Yeah, that's quite free. So the stiffness was all here, and you can see sort of dried oils or grease on there. That would be sticking on the back of the case. So this can come apart. There are 3 screws that hold the retainer plate in place. And tip that lot out. That's the piece that turns and swings the ends of the blades inwards and outwards. Here's our rosette of blades. It's normal for them to come out like that even if they're not stuck with oil. Okay, this is interesting. See, some of these blades are notched. Others are plain. Now, it's still a puzzle to me exactly what the story was. They're probably not in any normal sequence. I believe that basically the notching was done to reduce the area of blades that were rubbing over the top of each other, and therefore reduce the likelihood of the blades sticking. And the whole blades, I think they were probably all assembled at one end, because when you go to assemble the diaphragm, it's much easier to assemble a shutter full of these than it would be to assemble a shutter full of these things, because they're just harder to get laid over each other and swung back in position correctly. So that'll be entertaining. So there's 10 blades there. I'm fairly confident the whole blades all go at one end of the shutter. And here's the mechanism plate. So 5 blades. First blade there, exactly where I'd expect it. 2, 3, 4, 5. tip those out. They're not particularly sticky. What's the blade actuating ring like? What's its action like? That's not bad. That suggests that our slow speed problem may lie in the retard gear train. Even that feels not too bad. What's this lever like? That's okay. So yeah, the fact that the shutter didn't work correctly at the low speeds, I think was a combination issue. A little bit of this and a little bit of that. It was not mostly caused by one particular thing. That screw felt a bit funny coming out. I wonder whether the post it goes into is not riveted correctly into the mechanism plate. I wonder if someone over tightened that screw and made a botch of it. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. The threaded bush here that lever threads into rotates in the case. Okay, I'm going to have to do something about that. It's got 3 small stake marks around it. I'll have to see if I can improve those. I may be able to get, it's down below the level of this plate. So I may be able to put a drop of super glue or something on there to stop that coming loose. Yeah, I've never struck that before, that's unusual. Alright, so we have retainer screws here on the retaining plate. We've got 3 on the shutter. They may be all the same length or they may not. This one's longer. Yeah, so 2 shorties and 1 longer one. Take the retainer off and there's our blade actuating ring. So all these components need to be cleaned. So the only area of concern for me is that tiny bush there, that threaded bush. I'm going to have to stake that in place somehow. I won't have a punch small and sharp enough to make much of an impression on that, but I can probably use a heavy sewing needle or something just to whack down those 3 punch marks, bind them into that plate better. I'll have a close look at this with a jeweler's eyeglass. I think that sat further around from that, and that indentation locked into that one there. Oh well, I'll find out about that. But apart from that minor problem, the shutter should be a straightforward job.